Hello, I am Eli Adashi, Professor of Medical Science at Brown University and host of Medscape One-on-One. Joining me here is Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the NIH. The recipient of many honors, Dr. Fauci has been at the forefront of this nation's struggles with infectious diseases for close to 30 years. Today's conversation marks 30 years since the emergence of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, surely one of history's worst. Welcome.
Good to be here.
What actually happened on June 5, 1981, which was historic,
Right.
perhaps transforming, and which we are recognizing today?
Right. Well, I can remember very specifically how it affected me. I was sitting in my office at the NIH when the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report of June 5th, 1981 just was on my desk, and I picked it up, and there was this report which was very curious. I had been a infectious disease trained person, had been doing infectious disease and immunology for the previous 10 years, and I read this report of 5 men, curiously all gay, all otherwise healthy prior, who presented in Los Angeles with pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And I said, wow, that's unusual. And
Which is an opportunistic infection.
Well, it was an opportunistic infection that I saw not infrequently, because when I would do infectious disease consults for the Cancer Institute patients who were getting chemotherapy for their cancer, occasionally they would develop this as an opportunistic infection, particularly those who were on glucocorticoids. So I looked at it and I said, gee, this is an oddity, and I kind of put it in the back of my mind as a curiosity that might just disappear and we'll never hear about it again. But then about a month later, on the 4th of July in 1981, the second Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report came out, now showing an additional 26 men, again, curiously all gay, otherwise previously healthy, who not only had pneumocystis pneumonia, but other infections and an unusual form of cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. Again, not only from LA, but from San Francisco and New York City. And it was really at that point for me, as a physician scientist, as one of the first times in my professional career that I actually got goose pimples looking at something, because I didn't know what it was, but it was something new, because I've been doing infectious disease for the previous 10 years. I hadn't seen anything like this. And I made a decision at that point in my career to turn around what I was doing and to start pursuing this mystery-type disease. So with those 2 reports began the era of HIV/AIDS that we didn't know was HIV. We weren't calling it AIDS. We knew that it was mysterious, and we had no idea what caused it. And then from there unfolded historic events over the next 3 decades.
It now appears in retrospect that the story begins long before 1981, yes, when a predecessor of the HIV type 1 virus crossed the species barrier from a chimpanzee to a human.
Right.
How often does a disease make itself known that way? How often do we acquire new diseases, if you will, through such trans-species migration?
Well, much to the surprise of most people, quite frequently. Let me explain. We get emerging and re-emerging diseases, new diseases, all the time. I mean, literally, when I testify before the Congress, I'm always telling them each year about a new disease here or there. About 70% of the newly emerging infections are zoonotic in the fact that they jump from an animal species to a human. So 70% of the new infections are zoonotic. The issue is that not all of them have a major public health impact. The ones that do frequently is influenza, typical example, bird flu, swine flu, et cetera, But most of the things that jump species are curiosities, affect a relatively small number of people, and give us pause to think, but don't have a major impact on global health. Every once in a while, one of these emerging microbes not only jump species, but they explode through the population the way HIV/AIDS did. We didn't know it in the summer of 1981 that was going to happen. But there were several of us who were looking at this and saying, now, wait a minute, this is a sexually transmitted, certainly an infection, even though we didn't know what it was. One of the most universal things in the human species is sexuality. So we better be careful about whether this is going to stay confined. In fact, I remember I pulled it out the other day, an article that I wrote in December of 1981 that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 1982 that said anyone who thinks that this is going to stay restricted epidemiologically to a small group of individuals, because at that time it was only reported in gay men, I said is making an assumption that's based on no scientific information, because we don't know where this is going to go. And unfortunately, that caveat turned out to be true.
So that foresight was accurate, and we now know, of course, that perhaps over 60 million men and women were infected since the epidemic began. Right. As we speak, about 33 million individuals worldwide live with the disease. About 2.6 million men and women are infected annually. And there is no obvious end in sight, right, although there's some good news which we hopefully will get to before too long. Where do you see this going from the perspective of someone who now has 30 years of insight into this rather severe affliction that we had to handle?
Well, I think we are really at a turning point, a potential turning point and hopefully a real turning point. And let me explain what I mean. We've known since the mid-1990s, 1996, when the protease inhibitors were approved and we had the first real, what people call the cocktail or triple combination or heart, however you want to refer to it. But from that time, with additional new and better drugs, more user-friendly, instead of 25 pills, then 3 pills, then 1 pill, that we've had a major, major impact on treating people who are HIV infected. When I was thinking back at this anniversary time, when I was admitting patients to the NIH Clinical Center in the early 80s, before we even had AZT, the median survival, because they would come in to the hospital with advanced disease, not like today where you can get a serological test that could tell you were infected a month ago or 6 weeks ago. They came in with advanced disease. The median survival was 28, 29 weeks. Now, if a young person comes into our clinic who was recently infected and is, let's say, 20 years old, and you put him on appropriate therapy, you can mathematically model that that person will live an additional 50 years. So the advances in treatment have been stunning. We've had a number of advances in prevention, but the math of it tells us that we have a problem, and now we're hopefully getting closer to a solution. If you look at the infections worldwide, 90+% are in the developing world, 67% are in sub-Saharan Africa. For every person that we put on therapy in low and middle income countries, 2 to 3 people get newly infected. So critical right now is prevention. So you ask me, where are we now and where are we going? We now have a number of prevention modalities that have already proven to be effective. Condom use, behavioral modification, protect the blood supply, mother-to-child transmission, circumcision, pre-exposure prophylaxis in gay men, topical microbicides. We have a vaccine that's certainly not ready for prime time, but at least the concept that we can have a vaccine has now been proven. That'll be years away. But most recently, just within the last few weeks, we've had a real game changer in that it's been shown beyond a doubt what we already knew and strongly suspected from observational studies. We know now from a very good randomized controlled study among heterosexual couples that are discordant, one infected and one not, that if you treat somebody earlier rather than later, the early treatment has a major effect in diminishing the likelihood that the infected party would transmit the virus to their uninfected heterosexual partner. You put all of those things together right now, we have the means in prevention where not only do we have prevention modalities, but treatment itself actually can become a form of prevention. So there was that tension for a while, treatment or prevention. Now we can integrate treatment into the prevention modalities. The problem the world is facing is almost less of a scientific gap than an implementation gap, because the resources are very constrained for a number of reasons. And the implementation is going to be very, very difficult. And that right now, particularly with the recent data, a number of bodies, the UNAIDS, WHO, all different governments are re-looking at this now and saying, should there be any change in recommendations and guidelines and resources or what have you? So we're at a very dynamic part of the epidemic at this 30th anniversary that we do have the capabilities of making a major impact.
This might be a good point to reflect on the wisdom of investing in the epidemic up front, that is to say, in prevention, thereby saving later on in terms of less by way of a disease burden, versus remaining focused on treatment and really losing that opportunity perhaps up front.
I don't think I know your question is an extraordinarily appropriate question, but what we're seeing now is that we should not be pitting treatment against prevention. We should be implementing prevention modalities, but now we know that treatment actually is prevention. So we need to tear down these barriers of treatment or prevention and realize that we've got to implement all of the known prevention modalities, but we can now insert treatment. So for every person you put on treatment, it is no longer treatment or prevention.
It is
treatment as part of prevention. Yes. And what we really do need, and people are becoming to realizing that now, is that prevention almost never will be a unidimensional phenomenon. It'll be a combination of prevention, where there's not one thing that's going to be the showstopper for HIV/AIDS. It's going to be a number of things that work synergistically together. That's what I see as the future for where we're going with HIV now.
Perhaps going back now to the U.S. and focusing more internally, we've discussed worldwide issues thus far. How do you see the disease in the U.S.? Are we gaining? Where are the gaps? What else would you like to see happen?
Right.
Do we have a plan?
Yes. Well, the national strategy, which President Obama has spearheaded through the White House AIDS office, is a very good start towards the plan of where we're going. We've done very well up to now. We can do better. What I see as the challenges and the gaps are pretty clear in my mind. We've had in this country, back in the days when we're talking about the 80s, where the number of new infections, particularly if you look at San Francisco and New York, the number of new infections in the United States per year were 120, 150,000 new infections on any given year. It has gone down dramatically to 56,000. That's the good news. The bad news is that it has stayed at 56,000 for the last 10 plus years. We've got to get below that. And one of the reasons that I believe we're not is that we've got to be more aggressive in seeking out, voluntarily getting people tested, linking them to care, and getting them under treatment. And there's some good reasons for that. There are about 1.1 million people infected in this country. At least 20% of them do not know that they are HIV infected. The majority of new infections that are transmitted from someone who doesn't know that they're infected. So we have a program in collaboration with the CDC and with HRSA in which what we're doing is we're going out into the community in some Sentinel pilot cities and seeing how far we can push the envelope about seeking out, identifying, voluntarily testing, and getting people linked to care. And it gets back to what we were saying just a moment ago. Then all of a sudden, not only are you helping the person who's infected, but you're preventing them from infecting other individuals. So if we can implement that program, what I'd like to see finally after 10 years of watching this flat line is to see that 56,000 go way down. Because once it does, then the dynamics of infectious diseases are such that it will be self-propagating decrease, because the fewer people that are infected, the less are those that are going to infect other people. So you've got to interrupt the dynamics of the epidemic in this country and globally.
It may be too much to hope for today, but as you reflect about the prospect of cure, someday, somehow, what comes to mind?
Well, it is not going to be easy. I believe it's feasible. At the NIH, we're putting a considerable amount of money. I've been talking about the potential for a cure for several years now. I think it's going to be multiple approaches. We think of a cure either as what I coined a few years ago, the word a functional cure, or a true microbiological eradication cure. So we know that we can treat people with combinations of drugs and get their virus load to below detectable level, and they will lead very healthy lives. The issue is they need to be on therapy indefinitely. So we and others have studied very carefully a small recalcitrant reservoir of HIV that it doesn't bother you when you're on therapy. But as soon as you stop therapy, in virtually all patients, the virus begins to replicate again, with few exceptions of people who would be elite controllers that you didn't realize they were elite controllers. So there are a couple of approaches to do. I believe that the earlier you start people on therapy, the smaller the viral reservoir will be, so the less of a challenge you'd have. We're working on new drugs now that might be able to get rid of that remaining reservoir. There are things that are in early development, like certain types of gene therapy experiments, gene therapy protocols that we're doing. That would be to completely get rid of the virus. The other one is to treat someone early enough so you suppress the virus, but do it at a point where the person's immune system has not been so devastated that they would not be able to contain the virus when you withdrew the drug. And that's where a new possibility for a therapeutic vaccine would come in, where you get somebody with undetectable viral load on treatment, but instead of getting them late when they've depleted their T-cell repertoire, get them early so they still have a good immune potential left and boost that. That could be a functional cure. So bottom line, short answer is, I believe it's feasible. I don't think it's going to be able to be done in everyone, but I think that a certain percentage of people who are HIV infected, we may be able to do that within a reasonable period of time.
On the presumption that we are not likely to treat our way out of the epidemic, and that prevention is rarely perfect, vaccine always seems to feature in the overall plan. We've had some good news in the last year or two. Most recently, a simian virus was being experimented with, and the results appear to have been promising. Could you summarize for our viewers where we stand on the vaccine front?
Okay, so let's take a look at what we see in humans and what we see in animal models. At the end of the day, it's the human model that counts.
Yes.
So the good news, as you mentioned, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had a human trial in Thailand called RV144, which gave a modest, at best, protection of 31% in people who were vaccinated versus those who were not vaccinated. That was a proof of concept. Unlike other infections, where it is usually clear that the body is capable of inducing an immune response that would clear the virus, eradicate it, and leave you with long-term immunity against reinfection. We don't have that with HIV. Amazingly, the body does not handle this well at all, and there are no instances of anybody who's actually spontaneously completely cleared the virus. So the idea that only until a year and a half, 2 years ago, we didn't even have a proof of concept whether this is possible. Now we feel it's possible. What we've got to do now is figure out how to precisely identify what correlative immunity there is. Can you induce it in a human? So the human experiments are going in the direction of trying to figure out what the correlates of immunity. We've had some animal non-human primate studies recently that have had some very impressive results in not necessarily in preventing initial infection, but in developing an immune response that keeps the virus completely suppressed for a considerable period of time. And when you look for the virus, you can't even find it, which means that maybe they got an initial infection, but that infection was aborted. So there's a lot of exciting animal data, but there are also some very important things that are going on in human trials. When are we going to get a vaccine? No one can make that prediction. But really, for the first time since the beginning, when I think about vaccines, I think that there really is real light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but a lot of things are happening now. The identification of broadly reacting neutralizing antibodies, the ability to use very precise clonal techniques to pull out the B cells that are making these antibodies, identifying neutralizing epitopes on the envelope of HIV. The trick now is how do you get that epitope on the envelope and put it in a form that's immunogenic, that induces a response that protects. But at least we have a roadmap of where we want to go. Whereas years ago, it was all empiric. Try this, it doesn't work. Try that, it doesn't work. We're beyond that now. We really have a pretty good idea about what we need to do. It's going to take some time, but we're going to do it.
That is good news. We would probably be remiss if we didn't mention the role of advocates and activists in the last 30 years. And you happen to be in a unique position to comment on that through your interactions with Larry Kramer and with many celebrities along the way. Can you try to do justice to the role of advocates and activists in getting us where we are today?
I can say the very short version is it was huge impact. Positive impact. A little bit more details is how they did it. I look at it in two phases. First of all, HIV/AIDS is a completely unique situation from a public, domestic, and global health standpoint. We in the scientific community, those in the regulatory community, those in the public health community, looked upon it as, we'll approach it in the usual way we approach it. Everything's got to be pristine. Pristine clinical trials. You got to go through 4,000 hoops before you get a drug approved. You've got to design a trial with all of these exclusion criteria. The activists didn't buy that. They were saying, this is different. We're all young. We're seeing our friends die. We have, we don't have any treatment. It isn't as if there are 5 treatments and you want to do a trial to make a 6th one that's better. We have nothing. We've got to be able to be flexible on the clinical trial approach. We've got to loosen up the regulatory approach and do more. By the time a drug gets approved, we'll all be dead, that kind of a thing. So that's what they were saying. Now, the issue is they needed to get the attention of the authorities. And they would do very dramatic, theatrical things. Invade the stock exchange. Invade St. Patrick's Cathedral. Invade the NIH and the FDA with smoke bombs in theater. I guess the thing that I did, which was very lucky, and one of the things that I'm, I guess, most proud of, is that right from the beginning, rather than get put aback by people who are being theatrical, which many scientists, when they see those things, they flinch back. They're quite conservative. They don't want these outside influences. But if you just forget about what they're doing and listen to what they're saying, and read what they're writing, they were making perfect sense. So the turnaround came for me when they were essentially storming the NIH campus. Since I was out there doing what I felt we needed to do, my face and my name was associated with the federal government. So I was the face of the federal government. So they figured, why don't you just go and attack, Fauci, you're killing us, you're burning an effigy, and all those sorts of things. So rather than push them away when they invaded the NIH campus, I told the police not to arrest them, but to actually bring 5 or 6 of their leaders to my conference room, and we'll sit down and talk about how we can start a partnership where we can get them involved, listen to them. We didn't agree with everything they said, because although they were mostly right, they were incorrect on certain things. And that began a process to the point where now that they had our attention, they were extremely valuable in giving us input in how to design the trials, the kinds of needs in the community, to the point where if you look on any of our advisory committees, any of our councils, there are always activists on there. So it started off as an adversarial role, but they made a major contribution to how we approached it. So I would think that among the top few things that were positive factors and positive issues in HIV/AIDS, the embracing the activist community has to be right up there.
They have shown us things we did not see.
Absolutely.
On a personal note, if I may, of all your multiple accomplishments in this arena, and perhaps others, what are you most proud of? What do you feel stands out as a game changer during your professional lifetime?
Well, there are a couple. One that stands out more than others. I think the decision I made very early on, when I was in the midst of a very successful career that had nothing to do with AIDS, to realize that I was going to change the direction of my research, much to the chagrin of my advisors and friends and mentors, and start studying this disease. When I became the director of NIAID in 1984, just a few years into the pandemic, to really push as hard as I could to get more resources. And I had the privilege of dealing closely with every president since Reagan through George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and now President Obama with his Global Health Initiative and PEPFAR. My scientific accomplishments are part of a big team. A lot of people made scientific accomplishments, but my working with the activists, I think, was a game changer, getting them in. But the thing that was really the game changer was I was in the fortunate position to have developed a close relationship with President George W. Bush, only because I knew him during his father's presidency, George H.W. Bush. But George W. Bush, he was keenly interested in seeing what we could do in the developing world. And he sent me, together with Secretary Thompson, down to Africa to figure out if we could come back with some facts. It was a fact-finding mission. When I came back, we spoke to him about the opportunities, and he said, I want you to put together a program that would actually transform, a game changer, something where the United States of America can really have an impact on people in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. So I spent about 7 or 8 months of my life working 2 jobs. One job was running the institute. The other one was putting together, in a mathematical model way, what countries, how much prevention, how much whatever. I employed a person who was with me in my lab, who then became my assistant, named Mark Dybel, who ultimately became the second ambassador for PEPFAR. Right. And when I worked on that, going back and forth to the White House a lot, until finally the White House staff, who were very generous in getting me access, we presented to the president, and he said, we're going to do it. And that's how PEPFAR was born. And he announced it at his State of the Union address on January 28th of 2003. We still have PEPFAR now. It's part of the global health program under President Obama. But for me personally, to have had the opportunity and the privilege to work with the administration at that point to put together what is now, clearly the most successful and greatest impact program in global health that we've ever had, was I'm so pleased that I had the opportunity to have done that.
it may be worth noting that that particular initiative converted the U.S. really to the largest donor on Earth in global health in general,
right. Exactly.
and in HIV/AIDS in particular, and we remain in that category.
Right.
Thank you very much for a wonderful conversation. On that note, sincere thanks to Dr. Fauci and to you, our viewers, for joining Medscape One-on-One. Until next time, I am Eli Adashi.